Imagine walking through an ancient cemetery at midnight and hearing footsteps behind you. But when you turn around, you see a man who has been walking those same paths for over 2,000 years. His eyes hold the weight of watching every person he ever loved grow old and die, while he remains frozen in time, unable to join them in death's peaceful embrace. This is not a ghost story or a vampire tale. This is the untold story of the most impossible man who ever lived. What if the greatest miracle in human history was not Jesus rising from the dead, but what happened to the man Jesus brought back to life? Welcome to our channel, where we explore forbidden questions and hidden truths of history, religion, and the unknown. If you love journeys that challenge what you thought you knew, make sure to join us, because today's story may change the way you see everything. 2,000 years ago, in a small village called Bethany, Jesus performed his most shocking miracle. He called a dead man named Lazarus back to life after 4 days in the tomb. But what the Bible never tells us is what happened next, and what if death could never touch Lazarus again. Chapter 1. The Man Who Conquered Death. The smell of death hung heavy in the air as Jesus approached the tomb cut into the rocky hillside. 4 days had passed since Lazarus drew his last breath, and his body had already begun the natural process of decay. Mary and Martha, his beloved sisters, wept bitterly as they watched their friend and teacher arrive too late to heal their brother. But Jesus had not come to mourn. He had come to demonstrate the power of God over the greatest enemy of mankind, death itself. "Remove the stone," Jesus commanded, his voice cutting through the wails of the mourning crowd. Martha stepped forward, her face streaked with tears. "Lord, by now there will be a terrible smell. He has been dead for 4 days." Jesus looked at her with eyes that seemed to see beyond the physical world. "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" The heavy stone rolled away with a grinding sound that echoed off the surrounding hills. The crowd pressed backward, covering their faces against the expected stench of death. But something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would change one man's destiny forever. Jesus lifted his eyes toward heaven and prayed aloud so all could hear. "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, so they may believe that you sent me." Then, with a voice that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, Jesus called out, "Lazarus, come forth." Silence fell like a blanket over the crowd. Hearts stopped beating as everyone strained to listen for any sound from the dark tomb. Then, like something from a dream, a figure appeared in the shadows. Wrapped in burial cloths, moving with uncertain steps, Lazarus emerged from the place of death back into the world of the living. The crowd erupted in cries of amazement, fear, and praise. Some fell to their knees in worship, while others ran away in terror. But Jesus simply smiled and said, "Unbind him and let him go." As the burial wrappings fell away, Lazarus stood before them, alive, breathing, his eyes wide with wonder and confusion. He looked at Jesus with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that seemed to suggest he had seen things beyond human understanding. This miracle became one of the most powerful testimonies to Jesus' divine authority. But for Lazarus, it was only the beginning of a journey that would span centuries and challenge everything humanity believed about life, death, and the space between them. Chapter 2. The Weight of Eternal Life. In the days following his resurrection, Lazarus struggled to adjust to life among the living. His sisters Mary and Martha watched him carefully, noticing changes that went deeper than the physical transformation. There was a distance in his eyes, as if part of him remained in that place beyond death where he had spent 4 days. Lazarus remembered fragments of his experience in death, glimpses of brilliant light, voices speaking in languages beyond human words, and a peace so profound that returning to earthly life felt like waking from the most beautiful dream into a harsh reality. Yet he found himself unable to speak clearly about what he had seen, as if the human mind lacked the words to describe divine mysteries. The resurrection had changed more than just his physical state. Lazarus discovered that his perspective on daily concerns had shifted dramatically. The worries that consumed his neighbors, money, status, petty disputes, seemed insignificant compared to the eternal realities he had glimpsed. This created a growing sense of isolation, even among those who loved him most. "Brother, you seem different," Martha observed one evening as they shared a meal. "You eat, you speak, you laugh with us, but sometimes you look at us as if you're seeing us from very far away." Lazarus reached across the table and took her hand. "I am still your brother, Martha. But I have seen things that have changed how I understand everything. I cannot unsee what I have seen, and I cannot forget what I have learned." Mary, ever the contemplative one, leaned forward with concern. "Do you regret coming back to us?" The question hung in the air like incense. Lazarus considered his words carefully. "I am grateful to be with you again. But I carry knowledge that feels too heavy for one person to bear. I remember the peace of that other place, and sometimes this world feels like exile from home." Word of the resurrection spread throughout Judea and beyond. Pilgrims traveled from distant regions just to see the man who had conquered death. Some came seeking healing, others came with questions about the afterlife, and still others came simply to touch someone who had crossed the ultimate boundary and returned. But not all the attention was welcome. The Pharisees and religious authorities saw Lazarus as a living threat to their power and control. If people believed that Jesus could raise the dead, their influence over the masses through fear and ritual would crumble. Secret meetings were held in Jerusalem, where religious leaders debated not only how to eliminate Jesus, but also what to do about his living miracle, Lazarus himself. "As long as this man walks among us," one Pharisee argued, "he is proof of Jesus' power. People will believe, and we will lose everything." Unknown to Lazarus and his family, plans were already forming to silence the testimony of the man who had returned from death. But death, having once released its grip on Lazarus, would prove to have no power over him again, though he would not discover this truth for many years to come. Chapter 3. The Divergence Point. Death cannot touch him. 63 years had passed since Jesus called Lazarus from the tomb. The Roman Empire had changed. Jerusalem lay in ruins, and most of those who witnessed the resurrection had long since died. Lazarus, now an old man with white hair and lined face, felt his body weakening with each passing day. He had lived a full life after his resurrection, marrying a kind woman named Rhoda and raising 3 children who gave him grandchildren to cherish. He had watched Mary and Martha grow old and pass peacefully into death, and he had said farewell to most of his generation. Now, at 91 years old, he prepared for his own final journey. Lying in his bed in a small house outside Jerusalem, Lazarus felt the familiar approach of death. His breathing grew shallow, his heart beat irregularly, and his family gathered around him with tears in their eyes. His eldest son held his hand as Lazarus whispered his final words of love and blessing. Then, as his family watched in grief, Lazarus drew his last breath and his heart stopped beating. But something unprecedented was about to happen. 3 hours after his death, as his family prepared his body for burial, Lazarus's eyes suddenly opened. His heart began beating strongly, his breathing returned to normal, and the color flooded back into his face. More shocking still, his aged appearance began to reverse itself. Wrinkles faded, his hair darkened, and his frail body regained the strength and vitality of a man in his prime. His family screamed in terror and amazement as they watched their patriarch transform before their eyes. Within minutes, Lazarus appeared to be no older than 35, healthy and strong, as if decades had been erased from his life. Lazarus sat up in bed, looking at his hands with wonder and growing horror. He realized that something had fundamentally changed in his nature during that first resurrection 70 years earlier. Death, which had claimed him briefly, found that it could not hold him. His body possessed some divine quality that reset itself, healing all damage and returning him to perfect health. "Father, what is happening to you?" his son asked, backing away in fear. Lazarus struggled to understand what he was experiencing. "I died, my son. I felt my spirit leaving my body just as it did long ago when Jesus called me back. But this time, something pulled me back on its own. Death tried to take me, but it could not hold me." Over the following days, Lazarus experimented carefully with his condition. Minor injuries healed instantly. When he deliberately cut himself, the wound closed within seconds. Most disturbing of all, his body seemed locked at the physical age of 35, the age he had been during his first resurrection. The realization struck him like lightning. Jesus had not simply brought him back to life temporarily. The resurrection had fundamentally altered his nature, making him immune to death's power forever. He was immortal, destined to watch everyone he loved grow old and die while he remained unchanged. His family, terrified and confused by this supernatural transformation, begged him to hide his condition from the world. They understood instinctively that such a miracle would bring attention from authorities who would seek to control, study, or eliminate him. Lazarus agreed, but he knew his life had changed forever. He would need to fake his own death periodically and assume new identities to avoid detection. The man who had been given the gift of eternal life was beginning to understand that it might also be a curse. The burden of watching every person he loved eventually leave him behind. This was the moment when Lazarus's true journey began, not as a man who had conquered death once, but as someone who could never be conquered by death again. Chapter 4: The First Century of Secrets. Learning to live as an immortal required skills that no human had ever needed to develop. Lazarus spent his first century of eternal life mastering the art of deception, creating false identities, and moving from place to place before people noticed his lack of aging. Every 30 to 40 years, Lazarus would stage his own death through elaborate schemes. Sometimes he would claim to be traveling to distant lands and simply never return. Other times, he would fake illness and arrange for a trusted friend to report his death while he secretly moved to a new region. He became expert at creating new names, new histories, and new relationships while carefully burying his past. The emotional toll of this constant deception weighed heavily on his heart. Lazarus learned that immortality meant saying goodbye to everyone he loved, over and over again, for eternity. He watched his children grow old and die, then his grandchildren, then their children, while he remained frozen at 35 years old. But Lazarus also discovered a purpose in his endless life. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, he used his immortality to serve as a secret guardian of the faith. He would appear in communities facing persecution, offering guidance and protection before disappearing again. During the reign of Emperor Nero, when Christians were being fed to lions and burned as human torches, Lazarus operated an underground network that helped believers escape persecution. He used different names in different cities: Marcus in Rome, Stephanos in Antioch, Josiah in Alexandria, but always with the same mission of protecting those who followed Jesus. His immortal perspective gave him advantages that mortal protectors lacked. He could take enormous risks because death could not claim him. He could accumulate resources and knowledge over decades, building networks of safe houses and trusted contacts that spanned the entire empire. Most importantly, he never forgot the faces of those who persecuted Christians, allowing him to warn communities about dangerous individuals and corrupt officials. Lazarus also became a living witness to the development of Christian doctrine and practice. He watched as the simple teachings of Jesus evolved into complex theological systems. He observed the writing and collection of the texts that would become the New Testament, sometimes providing anonymous guidance to authors and scholars who were trying to preserve accurate accounts of Jesus' ministry. During the Council of Jerusalem in 50 AD, Lazarus secretly attended as a servant, listening as the apostles debated whether Gentile converts needed to follow Jewish law. He wanted desperately to speak up and share his unique perspective, but he knew that revealing his identity would create chaos and potentially undermine the very movement he was trying to protect. The hardest moments came when Lazarus witnessed the deaths of people he had known during Jesus' earthly ministry. He watched from the shadows as Stephen was stoned to death, becoming Christianity's first martyr. He was present in Rome when both Peter and Paul were executed under Nero's persecution. Each death felt personal, as these were men who had known Jesus just as Lazarus had, yet they were granted the release of death while he was condemned to endless remembrance. By the end of his first century as an immortal, Lazarus had developed a complex understanding of his condition. He was both blessed and cursed, gifted with the ability to serve God's purposes across generations while bearing the crushing weight of infinite loss and loneliness. He began to keep detailed written records of everything he witnessed, understanding that his perfect memory and eternal perspective made him a unique historian of Christianity's development. These secret writings, hidden in caves and buried in remote locations, would become his gift to future generations, if he could ever find a way to share them safely. Chapter 5: The Burden of Immortal Memory. As Lazarus entered his third century of immortal existence, he made a disturbing discovery about his condition. Unlike normal human memory, which fades and softens painful experiences over time, his immortal mind retained every detail of his experiences with perfect clarity. Every death he witnessed, every goodbye he said, every moment of suffering remained as vivid as the day it happened. The accumulation of traumatic memories began to take a severe psychological toll. Lazarus found himself haunted not just by recent losses, but by the faces of every person he had ever loved and lost over the centuries. The young mother who died in childbirth in Gaul in 127 AD was as real in his mind as if he had lost her yesterday. The child who died of fever in Egypt in 156 AD still brought him to tears when he remembered holding the small body. Sleep became a torment because dreams would randomly select from his vast collection of memories, forcing him to relive the most painful moments of his endless existence. he would wake up screaming, remembering Martha's death as if it were happening for the first time, or reliving the moment he realized his own children had grown old and died while he remained young. Lazarus discovered that his immortal memory worked differently than human memory in another crucial way. He could not choose what to remember or forget. Every conversation, every face, every sensation was permanently etched into his consciousness with equal intensity. The sound of rain on a roof in Britain was as clear as the feeling of sand between his toes in Alexandria, even decades later. This perfect memory became both a blessing and a curse for his mission as a guardian of Christian truth. On one hand, he could serve as an infallible witness to historical events, remembering exact words spoken by the apostles and precise details about early Christian practices. He could correct errors in developing church traditions because he had been there to see what really happened. But the psychological burden grew heavier with each passing decade. Lazarus began to understand why humans were designed to forget. Memory that never fades means that grief never heals, loss never diminishes, and pain never truly ends. He carried the accumulated sorrow of centuries within his heart, and there was no escape through death or forgetfulness. To cope with his condition, Lazarus developed elaborate mental disciplines. He learned to compartmentalize his memories, creating mental categories and filing systems that allowed him to access specific information without being overwhelmed by associated emotions. He practiced meditation techniques borrowed from various philosophical schools, seeking ways to observe his memories without being destroyed by them. During this period, Lazarus also encountered others who seemed to possess unusual longevity or supernatural abilities. In the mountains of Persia, he met an old man who claimed to have lived for centuries and who taught him breathing techniques for managing immortal consciousness. In the libraries of Alexandria, he discovered references to other individuals throughout history who had mysteriously vanished and reappeared across different generations. These encounters raised disturbing questions about his uniqueness. Was he truly the only immortal being walking the earth, or were there others like him? Had Jesus' resurrection power affected others in ways that were never recorded? The possibility that he might not be alone both comforted and terrified him. By 250 AD, Lazarus had developed a complex relationship with his immortal memory. He learned to use it as a tool for his protective mission, while building mental walls to prevent it from destroying his sanity. He began writing more extensively, using his perfect recall to create detailed histories of early Christianity that no mortal historian could match. But the fundamental problem remained. Lazarus was accumulating an infinite amount of grief with no natural way to process or release it. His immortal body might be immune to death, but his mind and heart were being slowly crushed under the weight of endless remembrance. Chapter 6: Shaping Religious History from the Shadows. By the 4th century, Lazarus had learned to use his immortal status strategically to influence Christian development from behind the scenes. His centuries of experience and perfect memory made him uniquely qualified to guide church leaders toward decisions that preserved Jesus' original teachings while avoiding theological disasters. When Emperor Constantine prepared for the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, Lazarus realized this gathering would shape Christianity for centuries to come. He could not attend as himself, but he found ways to influence the proceedings through careful manipulation and anonymous guidance. Disguised as a scholarly scribe named Didymus, Lazarus gained access to the pre-council meetings where bishops debated the nature of Christ's divinity. He listened as church leaders struggled with questions about Jesus' human and divine natures, debates that could split Christianity permanently if handled poorly. Using his first-hand knowledge of Jesus' teachings and personality, Lazarus began leaving anonymous notes for key bishops. These notes contained precise quotations from Jesus' private conversations and specific details about his behavior that only someone who had been present could know. The notes were attributed to an ancient witness and gradually gained influence among the council participants. Bishop Hosius of Cordoba, Constantine's advisor, found a particularly detailed note on his desk one morning. It contained Jesus' exact words from a conversation with the disciples about his relationship with the Father, words that had never been recorded in any gospel, but which Lazarus remembered perfectly. The note helped shape the language of the Nicene Creed in ways that preserved orthodox Christian belief, while avoiding extreme positions that could have caused permanent divisions. Lazarus also worked to preserve important Christian texts that were in danger of being lost or destroyed. He secretly copied documents from various church libraries, creating hidden archives in remote locations across the empire. His perfect memory allowed him to recreate entire books from memory when original copies were destroyed during persecution or neglect. In one instance, when the complete writings of an early church father were about to be burned by opposing theological factions, Lazarus memorized the entire collection during a single night of reading. Years later, he anonymously donated perfect copies to 3 different monasteries, ensuring the preservation of theological insights that would have been lost forever. His influence extended beyond theological matters to practical church governance. When corruption began creeping into church leadership positions, Lazarus would arrange for evidence of misconduct to mysteriously appear in the right hands at the right time. When worthy candidates for important positions were being overlooked due to politics or prejudice, Lazarus found ways to bring their qualifications to the attention of decision-makers. The moral weight of this secret influence troubled Lazarus deeply. He wrestled with questions about whether he had the right to manipulate human history, even for good purposes. Was he serving God's will, or was he playing God himself? His immortal perspective allowed him to see long-term consequences that mortal leaders could not perceive. But did that justify his hidden interference in human affairs? These ethical dilemmas became more complex when Lazarus realized he could prevent certain historical disasters, but only through actions that would reveal his supernatural nature. He watched the Library of Alexandria burn, knowing he could have prevented it, but unable to act without exposing himself. He observed corrupt church leaders gaining power when he could have stopped them, but intervention would have required revealing knowledge that no mortal could possess. By the end of the 4th century, Lazarus had developed a careful balance between intervention and restraint. He would act to preserve essential Christian teachings and prevent catastrophic theological errors, but he would not interfere with the natural development of human institutions and leadership. His role was to be a guardian of truth, not a controller of human destiny. This philosophy would guide his actions for the next 1,000 years, as he continued to work in the shadows, protecting Christianity from its enemies while allowing it to grow and adapt naturally to changing human circumstances. Chapter 7: The Medieval Mysteries. The fall of the Roman Empire forced Lazarus to adapt his methods of secret influence to a new and more chaotic world. As barbarian tribes swept across Europe and established their own kingdoms, he found opportunities to embed himself within the growing network of Christian monasteries that became centers of learning and stability. During the 6th century, Lazarus assumed the identity of Brother Augustine in a monastery near Tours, France. For 40 years, he worked as a copyist and scholar, using his position to preserve important texts while secretly guiding the spiritual development of younger monks. His perfect memory allowed him to spot errors in copied manuscripts and suggest corrections that maintained the integrity of Christian teachings. The monastic life suited his immortal nature in unexpected ways. The emphasis on discipline, meditation, and separation from worldly concerns helped him manage the psychological burden of his endless existence. The regular rhythms of prayer, work, and study provided structure that his immortal mind craved after centuries of constant change and adaptation. But the medieval period also brought Lazarus face to face with Christianity's capacity for violence and corruption. When Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, Lazarus found himself torn between his loyalty to Christianity and his horror at religious warfare. He traveled to Jerusalem during the Crusades, witnessing the brutal conquest of the Holy City in 1099. Standing in the streets where Jesus had walked, now flowing with the blood of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, Lazarus questioned whether Christianity had completely lost its way. The soldiers who slaughtered civilians in Jesus' name seemed to embody everything that Christ had preached against. During this period, Lazarus began encountering other individuals who possessed unusual longevity or supernatural abilities. In the mountains of Tibet, he met a Buddhist monk who claimed to have lived for over 3 centuries through advanced meditation techniques. In the forests of northern Europe, he encountered a woman who appeared to be ageless and who spoke of ancient pagan traditions that predated Christianity. These meetings forced Lazarus to confront uncomfortable questions about his faith. If other spiritual traditions could produce extraordinary longevity or supernatural abilities, what made his Christian resurrection unique? Were there multiple paths to transcending death, or was his immortality truly a singular gift from Jesus? The encounter that most challenged his assumptions came in 1187, when he met a man calling himself Cartaphilus in the markets of Damascus. This stranger claimed to be the legendary wandering Jew, cursed to walk the earth until Christ's return because he had mocked Jesus on the way to crucifixion. "You are not the only one condemned to endless life," Cartaphilus told him during a secret meeting. "There are others like us, scattered across the world, each bearing our own burden of immortality for different reasons." This revelation shattered Lazarus's assumption that he was unique. If there were other immortals, each with their own story and purpose, what did that mean for his understanding of his role in God's plan? Was he part of a larger supernatural strategy, or was immortality simply a side effect of direct contact with divine power? The medieval period taught Lazarus that Christianity was far more complex and contradictory than he had imagined during its early centuries. The same faith that produced saints and mystics also created crusaders and inquisitors. The church that preserved learning and helped the poor also accumulated wealth and political power that corrupted its spiritual mission. By 1300, Lazarus had developed a more nuanced understanding of his role as an immortal guardian. Rather than trying to control Christianity's development, he focused on preserving its core spiritual truths while allowing human institutions to evolve naturally, even when that evolution led in directions he found disturbing. He also began seeking out other immortals, hoping to understand the broader supernatural ecosystem of which he was apparently a part. This quest would lead him to discoveries that would challenge everything he thought he knew about divine purpose and eternal life. Chapter 8: Renaissance Revelations. The Renaissance brought unprecedented change to European society. and Lazarus found himself adapting to a world where ancient certainties were being questioned by new discoveries in science, art, and philosophy. For the first time in centuries, he felt excited about human potential rather than simply protecting humanity from its own mistakes. In 1453, Lazarus arrived in Florence under the identity of Lorenzo Benedetti, a wealthy merchant and patron of the arts. His centuries of accumulated knowledge and resources allowed him to move easily among Renaissance intellectuals, while his immortal perspective gave him unique insights into human creativity and innovation. He became a secret patron of several major Renaissance figures, providing anonymous funding for artistic projects and scientific research. Through carefully placed suggestions and strategic introductions, he helped connect brilliant minds who might not have met otherwise. His influence remained hidden, but his impact on Renaissance culture was profound. Lazarus found himself particularly drawn to the scientific revolution that was beginning to challenge church teachings about the nature of the universe. When he met a young astronomer who was secretly studying the movements of the planets, Lazarus faced a moral dilemma. His first-hand knowledge of divine power made him certain that God existed, but the new scientific discoveries suggested that many church teachings about the physical world were simply wrong. The conflict became personal when Lazarus encountered Galileo Galilei in 1610. The scientist's telescopic observations of Jupiter's moons provided clear evidence that not everything in the universe revolved around Earth, contradicting official church doctrine. Lazarus knew that Galileo was correct, but he also knew the church would persecute him for these discoveries. Using his influence within church circles, Lazarus tried to moderate the institution's response to Galileo's findings. Through anonymous letters to key church officials, he argued that scientific discovery could enhance rather than threaten faith. But his efforts met with limited success, and he was forced to watch as the church condemned Galileo for teaching truths that Lazarus knew to be accurate. This period also brought Lazarus into contact with Renaissance artists who were revolutionizing religious art. He secretly posed for several painters, his immortal features appearing in various religious scenes across different decades. Art historians would later puzzle over the mysterious model who appeared in works by multiple masters, never aging despite the decades between paintings. The most challenging encounter came when Lazarus met Leonardo da Vinci in 1503. The great artist and inventor possessed an almost supernatural curiosity about the nature of life and death, and his anatomical studies brought him dangerously close to discovering the truth about immortal physiology. During a late-night conversation in Leonardo's workshop, surrounded by anatomical drawings and mechanical inventions, the artist looked directly into Lazarus's eyes and said, "You are not what you appear to be, my friend. There is something in your face, something in the way you speak of ancient times, that suggests you have seen more than any mortal man should see." Lazarus deflected the inquiry with humor, but Leonardo's perception troubled him. If the Renaissance spirit of inquiry continued to develop, how long would it be before scientific methods could detect and analyze immortal beings? The world was becoming more dangerous for those who carried supernatural secrets. The Renaissance also forced Lazarus to confront the growing gap between his Christian identity and his expanding understanding of truth. The rediscovery of classical philosophy, the development of humanistic thinking, and the evidence of scientific observation all suggested that reality was far more complex than medieval Christianity had taught. Yet his personal experience of resurrection and divine power remained undeniable. Lazarus began developing a more sophisticated theology that incorporated new knowledge while maintaining his core faith. He realized that God's truth might be larger and more inclusive than any single religious tradition could contain. By 1600, Lazarus had learned to navigate the tension between faith and reason, tradition and innovation, divine mystery and scientific understanding. The Renaissance had taught him that truth could emerge from multiple sources, and that his role as an immortal guardian might involve protecting not just Christian doctrine, but the broader human quest for knowledge and meaning. This expanded understanding would prove crucial as he entered an age of global exploration and religious conflict that would test every assumption about divine purpose and human destiny. Chapter 9: The Age of Exploration and Colonization. The European discovery of the Americas opened new chapters in human history, and Lazarus felt compelled to witness how Christianity would spread to lands and peoples that had never heard of Jesus. In 1521, he sailed with Spanish conquistadors to Mexico, hoping to ensure that Christ's message would be shared with love rather than imposed through violence. What he witnessed in the New World horrified him beyond anything he had experienced in 15 centuries of immortal life. Spanish soldiers destroyed entire civilizations in the name of Christianity, burning indigenous texts, toppling temples, and enslaving populations. Priests blessed conquests that resulted in the deaths of millions of native peoples who had committed no crime except worshipping different gods. Standing in the ruins of Tenochtitlan, watching Spanish soldiers melt down gold artifacts that represented centuries of Aztec craftsmanship, Lazarus wept for the loss of human knowledge and beauty. The conquistadors justified their actions by claiming they were bringing salvation to pagan lands. But Lazarus saw only the destruction of divine creativity expressed through different cultures. His most challenging encounter came when he met indigenous spiritual leaders who possessed their own traditions of communication with the divine. A Mayan priest named Itzel spoke of visions and spiritual experiences that seemed remarkably similar to what Lazarus had witnessed during his own death and resurrection. The priest described realms of light and divine beings that sounded identical to what Lazarus remembered from his time beyond death. Your God and our gods may be the same divine reality seen through different eyes, Itzel told him during a secret meeting in the jungle. Why do your people insist that only they know the way to the sacred realm? This conversation shattered one of Lazarus's fundamental assumptions about Christianity's unique truth. If indigenous peoples could have authentic spiritual experiences without ever hearing of Jesus, what did that mean for Christian claims of exclusive salvation? Had God been revealing himself to all peoples throughout history, using languages and symbols appropriate to each culture? Lazarus traveled throughout the Americas over the following centuries, observing how Christianity blended with indigenous beliefs to create new forms of religious expression. In Peru, he watched as Inca sun worship merged with Catholic saints to create syncretic practices that honored both traditions. In Mexico, he witnessed the emergence of devotion to the Virgin of Guadalupe, which seemed to bridge Aztec goddess worship and Christian Marian devotion. These developments troubled some church authorities, but Lazarus began to see them as evidence of God's universal presence rather than religious corruption. Perhaps divine truth was large enough to embrace multiple cultural expressions, and perhaps the missionary enterprise should focus on sharing love rather than demanding conformity to European religious forms. His global travels also brought him into contact with other religious traditions in their homelands. In India, he spent time with Hindu mystics who described experiences of divine union that echoed his own spiritual encounters. In China, he studied with Buddhist monks whose teachings about compassion and enlightenment seemed to reflect the same spiritual truths that Jesus had taught. The most profound encounter occurred in Japan, where Lazarus met a Zen master who seemed to possess unusual longevity and spiritual insight. During a meditation session in a mountain temple, the master looked at him with knowing eyes and said, "You carry the burden of endless time, but you have not yet learned to be present in the eternal now." This teaching began a new phase in Lazarus's spiritual development. Instead of focusing on his immortal condition as a burden or a mission, he began exploring how eternal consciousness could become a gateway to deeper spiritual understanding. The Eastern emphasis on presence and awareness offered tools for managing immortal existence that Western Christianity had never provided. By 1700, Lazarus had developed a global perspective on divine truth that transcended his original Christian framework while still honoring his unique relationship with Jesus. He had come to believe that God's love was universal, expressing itself through multiple traditions and cultures, each offering authentic paths to spiritual realization. This expanded understanding would prove essential as he entered an age of scientific revolution and religious skepticism that would challenge all traditional forms of faith and require new ways of understanding the relationship between divine reality and human knowledge. Chapter 10: Industrial Revolution and Modern Doubt. The rapid transformation of society during the Industrial Revolution presented Lazarus with challenges unlike anything he had faced in 18 centuries of immortal existence. Steam engines, factories, and urban crowding created a world that seemed to move faster than his ability to adapt, while scientific discoveries challenged traditional religious beliefs in ways that threatened the foundations of Christian faith. In 1859, Lazarus read Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species and realized that the theory of evolution would create a crisis for Christianity that would dwarf all previous theological controversies. As someone who had witnessed divine power firsthand, he knew that God existed, but Darwin's evidence suggested that the biblical account of creation was not literally accurate. The conflict between faith and science became personal when Lazarus attended a lecture by Thomas Huxley in London in 1863. The biologist argued passionately that evolution had made religious belief obsolete, claiming that natural processes could explain life's complexity without requiring divine intervention. During the question period, Lazarus stood up and asked, "If natural processes can create consciousness and beauty and love, might not those processes themselves be expressions of divine creativity rather than alternatives to it?" Huxley paused, clearly intrigued by the question, and replied, "An interesting perspective, sir. You suggest that God might work through natural law rather than in spite of it." This exchange launched Lazarus into a new phase of his immortal mission. Instead of simply protecting traditional Christian doctrine, he began working to help faith evolve in response to scientific discovery. Through anonymous writings and strategic conversations, he promoted theological positions that embraced both divine reality and scientific truth. The psychological impact of immortality became more severe during this period as the pace of change accelerated. Lazarus had learned to cope with saying goodbye to individuals, but now he was saying goodbye to entire ways of life within single decades. The rural agricultural world he had known for centuries disappeared, replaced by industrial cities that seemed to disconnect humanity from natural rhythms and spiritual awareness. Urban poverty and industrial exploitation also challenged his understanding of divine providence. If God was loving and powerful, Why did the new economic system create such suffering for the masses while enriching a small elite? Lazarus walked through the slums of Manchester and Birmingham, witnessing child labor and urban misery that seemed to mock Christian claims about divine care for humanity. His immortal perspective allowed him to see patterns that troubled him deeply. Throughout history, technological progress had often increased human power without increasing wisdom or compassion. The same scientific knowledge that could cure disease could also create more efficient weapons. The same industrial capacity that could provide material abundance could also destroy natural environments and create new forms of human slavery. During this period, Lazarus also encountered the rise of aggressive atheism and materialism among European intellectuals. Unlike previous skeptics who had questioned specific religious doctrines, these thinkers rejected any possibility of supernatural reality. They viewed his own immortal existence as literally impossible, creating a strange situation where Lazarus found himself being told by experts that he could not exist. The most challenging encounter came in 1885, when Lazarus met Friedrich Nietzsche during one of the philosopher's periods of mental clarity. Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead represented more than intellectual skepticism. It reflected the spiritual emptiness that industrial society seemed to create in human hearts. Your Christian God may have once been alive in human consciousness, Nietzsche told him during a walk through the Swiss Alps, but he has been murdered by science, democracy, and commercial culture. Modern man no longer needs divine comfort because he has conquered nature through reason and technology. Lazarus listened carefully, recognizing that Nietzsche was describing a real cultural transformation. The certainties that had sustained previous generations were crumbling, and many people genuinely felt abandoned by God in an increasingly mechanical and meaningless universe. Yet Lazarus's immortal experience told him that Nietzsche was wrong about divine reality being dead. God might be hidden or ignored, but the spiritual dimension of existence remained as real as ever. The challenge was finding ways to help people rediscover divine presence in a world that seemed designed to distract them from spiritual awareness. By 1900, Lazarus had developed a deeper appreciation for the complexity of modern existence. Technology and scientific knowledge offered unprecedented opportunities for human flourishing, but they also created new forms of alienation and spiritual crisis that required fresh approaches to faith and meaning. His immortal perspective had taught him that human progress was neither purely good nor purely evil, but rather a complex mixture of potential that could lead toward either greater wisdom and compassion or toward more sophisticated forms of destruction and despair. His role as an immortal guardian would need to evolve to address these new challenges while preserving the essential truths that could guide humanity through its most dangerous and promising era. Chapter 11: The Forbidden Gospels. In 1947, Lazarus heard news that sent shockwaves through his immortal consciousness. Bedouin shepherds had discovered ancient scrolls in caves near the Dead Sea. As archaeologists began studying what would become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, Lazarus realized that humanity was about to uncover texts that had been hidden for nearly 2,000 years. More importantly, he knew that some of those caves contained documents he had personally hidden there in the 1st century AD, under the identity of Dr. Marcus Wellspring, a wealthy antiquities collector. Lazarus gained access to the archaeological team working on the scrolls. His perfect memory allowed him to identify texts immediately, and his immortal resources enabled him to acquire several documents before they could be fully studied by mainstream scholars. Among the scrolls were 3 that Lazarus had written himself during the decades following Jesus' crucifixion. These Lazarus Gospels contained his first-hand account of conversations with Jesus that had never been recorded in the canonical Bible, including discussions about the true nature of death, resurrection, and eternal life. The most explosive revelation in Lazarus's hidden gospel concerned Jesus' teachings about multiple resurrections. According to Lazarus's account, Jesus had explained that resurrection was not a unique miracle, but rather a natural spiritual process that all humans could potentially experience through divine grace and proper understanding. Death is not the opposite of life, Jesus had told Lazarus, according to the hidden text. Death is simply a transition from one form of consciousness to another. Those who truly understand this truth can move freely between states of being, just as I have shown you. The Gospel also contained Jesus' prophecy that other disciples would receive similar gifts of extended life to serve as witnesses and guardians until his return. According to Lazarus's account, Jesus had deliberately created a network of immortal followers who would preserve his teachings and protect humanity during the long centuries before the kingdom of heaven was fully established on earth. Faced with documents that could revolutionize Christianity or destroy it entirely, Lazarus made a difficult decision. He shared portions of the texts with a small group of trusted scholars, but he kept the most radical revelations secret. The world was not ready for the truth about immortal disciples or the true nature of resurrection consciousness. Dr. Margaret Foster, a biblical scholar at Oxford, who had gained Lazarus's trust over several years of collaboration, became his primary confidant in this crisis. During a private meeting in her study, surrounded by ancient texts and archaeological photographs, Lazarus revealed more about his identity than he had shared with anyone in decades. "Margaret, what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need you to listen with an open mind," he said, choosing his words carefully. "These texts are not just ancient documents to me. I was present when some of these conversations took place." Dr. Foster looked at him skeptically, but something in his manner made her pay attention. "Marcus, you're speaking as if you were alive 2,000 years ago. That's clearly impossible." Lazarus opened one of the hidden scrolls and began reciting a passage in perfect Aramaic, then translated it into English with nuances that revealed intimate familiarity with the original context. As he continued sharing details that no scholar could have known, Dr. Foster's skepticism gradually transformed into amazement and terror. "This is impossible," she whispered. "You're claiming to be... who exactly?" "I am the man Jesus called forth from the tomb in Bethany," Lazarus replied simply. "And I have been walking this earth ever since, carrying memories and knowledge that could transform human understanding of life, death, and divine purpose." The revelation created a crisis for Dr. Foster, who struggled to reconcile her scientific training with the evidence before her. But over the following months, as Lazarus shared more of his hidden knowledge and demonstrated abilities that no mortal could possess, she became convinced of his identity. Together, they began the delicate process of deciding what portions of the forbidden Gospels could be shared with the world without causing religious chaos or making Lazarus a target for those who would seek to control or eliminate him. The hidden texts revealed that Christianity's development had diverged significantly from Jesus' original teachings. The institutional church had emphasized salvation through belief and ritual, while Jesus had apparently taught practical methods for transcending death and achieving divine consciousness during earthly life. "We have a choice, Doctor," Foster told Lazarus during one of their late-night discussions. We can preserve these texts in secret, protecting religious stability, but denying humanity access to potentially transformative truths. Or we can release them gradually and risk destroying the faith that has sustained billions of people for 2 millennia. Lazarus stared out the window at the lights of Oxford, contemplating the weight of knowledge that could liberate or devastate human spiritual understanding. His immortal perspective had taught him that truth often came with a price that not everyone was prepared to pay. The decision about the forbidden Gospels would haunt him for decades to come, as he wrestled with the fundamental question of whether divine truth should be protected from humanity or shared, despite the risks it might create. Chapter 12: Cross-Religious Encounters. The discovery of his own hidden Gospels forced Lazarus to confront uncomfortable questions about Christianity's claims to exclusive religious truth. If Jesus had taught methods for transcending death that were not unique to Christian tradition, what did that mean for his understanding of salvation and divine purpose? In 1962, Lazarus traveled to India under the identity of Professor David Stirling, a religious studies scholar researching comparative mysticism. His goal was to investigate whether other spiritual traditions contained teachings or practices similar to what he had experienced through Christian resurrection. His first profound encounter came in a Tibetan monastery in Dharamshala, where he met the Dalai Lama during the early years of his exile from Tibet. During a private audience, the spiritual leader looked at Lazarus with eyes that seemed to perceive far more than his apparent age suggested. "You carry the weight of many lifetimes in your consciousness," the Dalai Lama observed quietly. "But these are not memories of past incarnations. They are memories of one continuous existence that has lasted far longer than normal human life allows." Lazarus felt exposed and vulnerable, but also relieved to speak with someone who seemed to understand his condition without requiring detailed explanations. "Your Holiness, I have lived for many centuries, witnessing the rise and fall of civilizations. I came here seeking wisdom about the nature of consciousness and death." The Dalai Lama smiled compassionately. In Buddhist understanding, consciousness is not bound by physical death. Some beings achieve states of awareness that allow them to maintain continuity across what others experience as death and rebirth. Your condition suggests that you have stumbled into such a state through divine intervention rather than through meditation and spiritual practice. This conversation opened new possibilities for understanding his immortal condition. Instead of viewing himself as a unique Christian miracle, Lazarus began to see his experience as one example of consciousness transcending normal physical limitations, a phenomenon that various spiritual traditions approached through different methods. His next significant encounter occurred in Rishikesh, India, where he met Swami Sivananda, a Hindu sage known for his deep spiritual realizations. During their conversations about the nature of eternal consciousness, the Swami shared teachings about the immortal soul that resonated powerfully with Lazarus's experience. The body dies, but the eternal self, the Atman, never dies, Sivananda explained during a sunset meditation by the Ganges River. Most people identify with the temporary body and fear death because they do not realize their true nature as eternal consciousness. But some beings, through grace or intense spiritual practice, maintain awareness of their immortal essence while still inhabiting physical form. These Eastern perspectives helped Lazarus develop a more sophisticated understanding of his condition. Rather than being trapped in eternal physical existence, he began to see himself as consciousness that had learned to operate beyond normal limitations of embodied life. His most challenging encounter came in Japan, where he studied Zen Buddhism with Master Dogen at Eiheiji Temple. The Zen approach to enlightenment emphasized direct experience over theological explanation, and the Master's teachings about the nature of time and consciousness offered radically new frameworks for understanding immortal existence. "You speak of centuries as if they were separate experiences," Master Dogen observed during a meditation session. "But all time exists in this present moment. Past and future are mental constructions that prevent you from experiencing the eternal now that is your true nature." This teaching began to transform Lazarus's relationship with his accumulated memories and experiences. Instead of carrying the weight of centuries as a burden, he learned to see all of his experiences as aspects of one eternal present moment that contained all of time within itself. The most profound realization came when Lazarus recognized that the spiritual truths he had learned through Christian resurrection were also present in other traditions, expressed through different languages and cultural forms. The universal nature of mystical experience suggested that divine reality was far more inclusive than any single religious tradition could contain. During his travels, Lazarus also encountered Sufi mystics in Turkey, Jewish Kabbalists in Israel, and indigenous shamans in South America, each offering unique perspectives on consciousness, death, and spiritual transcendence. These encounters gradually dissolved his assumption that Christianity held exclusive access to divine truth. By 1970, Lazarus had developed what he privately called universal mysticism, an understanding of divine reality that honored his Christian origins while embracing the authentic spiritual insights of all traditions. He realized that his immortal perspective had been preparing him to serve as a bridge between different religious paths, rather than as a defender of Christian exclusivity. This expanded spiritual understanding would prove essential as he entered an era when religious institutions worldwide would face unprecedented challenges to their authority and relevance in an increasingly interconnected and skeptical world. Chapter 13: The Vatican's Greatest Secret. In 1978, Pope John Paul II received a letter that would change the Catholic Church's understanding of its own history forever. The letter, delivered through carefully arranged intermediaries, contained detailed information about early Christian history that no living scholar could have known, along with photographic evidence of documents that had been lost for centuries. The letter was signed simply LB and requested a private audience to discuss matters of eternal significance to the Church's mission. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict XVI, was assigned to investigate the mysterious correspondent. His inquiry led to a clandestine meeting in the Vatican archives, where Lazarus revealed his identity to the highest levels of church authority for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. "Your Holiness, Your Eminences," Lazarus began, addressing the small group of church leaders who had gathered in absolute secrecy. "I am the man whom Jesus called forth from the tomb in Bethany. I have walked this earth for 20 centuries, serving as a witness to the truth of Christ's resurrection and a guardian of his authentic teachings." The initial reaction was skepticism and concern for Lazarus's mental health. But as he demonstrated knowledge that no mortal could possess, reciting conversations between the apostles, describing the physical appearance of biblical figures, providing details about early church history that contradicted official accounts, the church leaders were forced to confront an impossible reality. Cardinal Ratzinger, known for his theological brilliance and careful approach to doctrinal matters, conducted extensive interviews with Lazarus over several months. The conversations covered early Christian history, theological development, and the preservation of authentic apostolic tradition. "If you are truly who you claim to be," Ratzinger said during one of their meetings, "then you possess knowledge that could either strengthen the Church's foundations or destroy them entirely. Why reveal yourself now, after so many centuries of secrecy?" Lazarus explained his growing concern about Christianity's direction in the modern world. He had watched as the Church accumulated power and wealth while millions suffered in poverty. He had observed theological disputes that seemed to miss the essential message of love and compassion that Jesus had actually taught. Most troubling, he had seen the Church resist scientific truth and social progress in ways that made it seem irrelevant to contemporary human needs. The Church was meant to be a servant of divine love, not an institution that preserves its own authority at the expense of truth and justice, Lazarus told the Vatican leadership. "I can help you understand what Jesus actually intended, but only if you are willing to consider changes that may challenge traditional assumptions." After months of deliberation, Pope John Paul II made a decision that would remain one of the Vatican's most closely guarded secrets. Rather than revealing Lazarus's existence to the world, the Church would work with him privately to ensure that Catholic teaching remained faithful to authentic Christian origins. A special commission was created within the Vatican's most secretive departments, known only as the Apostolic Witness Project. This group consisted of 3 cardinals, 2 biblical scholars, and 1 theologian, all sworn to absolute secrecy about Lazarus's identity and involvement in their work. The commission's mandate was to consult with Lazarus on matters of doctrine, history, and pastoral concern, while protecting both his anonymity and the Church's institutional stability. They would use his knowledge to guide papal decisions and Church teaching without ever revealing the source of their information. Over the following decades, Lazarus's influence on Catholic teaching became subtle but significant. His insights helped shape papal encyclicals on social justice, environmental stewardship, and interfaith dialogue. His knowledge of early Christian practice influenced liturgical reforms and theological education. But the relationship was not without tension. Lazarus often pushed for more radical changes than the Church hierarchy was willing to consider. He advocated for female ordination based on his memory of women leaders in early Christian communities. He argued for a more inclusive approach to salvation that would acknowledge authentic spiritual experiences in other religious traditions. The Church moves slowly by necessity, Cardinal Ratzinger explained during one particularly heated discussion. Sudden changes could cause schism and confusion among the faithful. We must balance truth with pastoral wisdom. Lazarus struggled with the Church's caution, especially when he saw suffering that could be alleviated through more progressive policies. But he also understood the institutional pressures that made rapid change difficult for an organization that claimed divine authority and served over 1 billion followers worldwide. The most difficult moments came when Lazarus was asked to keep silent about church scandals or corruption that he could have exposed. His immortal perspective had made him sensitive to the gap between Christian ideals and institutional behavior, but his role as secret advisor required him to work within existing structures rather than challenging them publicly.